Okay. So those of you who are watching us on one of our two, either of our two platforms, YouTube and Facebook, you're in the right place tonight. We're going to be doing a book event with Dr. Yaba Blay, speaking on her new book, One Drop, Shifting the Lens on Race. She's going to do a presentation on the book. She's going to be in conversation with Damon Young, also a writer, a critic, and a humorist and satirist. I will introduce them more fully in a little bit once we get started. For right now, you know how it is. You tell people 7 o'clock and they don't all show up at that time. So we're going to give them a few minutes. We'll get started in 3 to 5 minutes. And I ain't going to hold up more than that, because for them that come in late, I want them to miss something and know that they should have got here more closer to on time to get the full thing. Also, I want to let people know that Dr. Blay's book, One Drop, is available at Revolution Books. You can come into the store to get it because we are opening up. We're not out of the woods on this pandemic yet, but we're at the place where we can open the store up and you can come in and shop. Revolution Books is located at Malcolm X Boulevard and 132nd Street. And you can come there and pick the book up. There's the information on it. You could also shop online at our online store. You can get Dr. Yaba Blay's book, One Drop, Shifting the Lens on Race. There's the information up on the screen now. I urge you to come in, and you also need to pay attention to this bookstore, because there are some very important things that happen here. The month of May, we're going to be doing a used book sale to raise funds for the National Get Organized for an Actual Revolution tour. That's going to be May 15th and 16th, Saturday and Sunday, from noon to 7 p.m. The following weekend, Sunday, May 23rd at 4 p.m. at the bookstore, we're going to be showing a very important film, a film of a talk by Bob Avakian, Why We Need an Actual Revolution and How We Can Really Make Revolution. I should say that I am Carl Dix, a longtime revolutionary. It goes all the way back to the 1960s and still on the front lines today because the job ain't finished. We still need a revolution. I am, in addition to being associated with Revolution Books, I am a representative of the Revolutionary Communist Party and a follower of Bob Avakian, the architect of a new framework for human emancipation, the new communism. So that's me, that's who I am. We're going to be getting started soon. And the other thing I wanted to tell you about, I got a listing of our events in May, but I also want to tell you about, we're going to kick June off with a program on June 1st, marking 100 years since the Tulsa Massacre, the destruction of Black Wall Street in the Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma, happened 100 years ago, began end of May, crossed over into June. And this is something you need to know about And this is something people got to learn the history of this country. And we're going to get into that some tonight. But people need to know where this reality that we're dealing with today came from. And tonight's going to be part of that. But the Tulsa massacre will be another part of that. Because one thing that people don't know, the period after World War I was a period where there was some real race riots. And I know people talk about the 1960s as a time of race riots. Those were rebellions, Black people standing up and saying, we ain't taking the horrors you're bringing down on us and suffering in silence no more. But right after World War I, there were race riots. Mobs of whites rampaged in Black areas, massacred people, burned down homes, stuff like that. June 1st, we're going to get into that, and we'll probably touch on the wave of such attacks that happened in that period. We are, as I was telling people earlier, we're reaching a point where I'm ready to get started. Those of you who are here, you got here on time. Folks who come in a little bit late, you're going to miss something. And remember that we give you a little bit of leeway and then we get started. So next time you got to be here and be ready to roll. Our program tonight is going to be an author event. The book is One Drop, Shifting the Lens on Race. We have the author with us, Dr. Yaba Blay, a scholar, an activist, and a cultural creator whose work is centered on the lived experience of Black women and girls. And as you'll find out about this through getting into this book, the Black experience in general. Her work has been featured in the New York Times, Ebony and the Root. And she's a professor at Drexel University, where she's co-director of the Africana Studies program. She's going to be in conversation tonight with Damon Young, writer, critic, humorist, satirist, author of What Doesn't Kill You Makes You Blacker, a memoir in essays. This book won Barnes & Noble's 2019 Discover Award, and it was long listed for a number of other awards, including PEN America Award, NAACP Image Award, a Hurston Wright Legacy Award, Thurber Prize for American Humor, and more. NPR named it one of its best books of 2019. He's also the co-founder of Very Smart Brothers. And when you hear the discussion tonight, you'll understand why he called it that he wasn't just selling wolf tickets when he did that. He's going to show and prove. So that's what we're going to do. And Revolution Books is a place where conversations like this happen. It's a place that's the cultural center of a movement for an actual revolution to overthrow, to get rid of this system and bring into being a society and world in which human beings can truly flourish. A place that values critical thinking, the poetic spirit, and the search for the truth, with a breadth of books and discussions that engage the questions confronting humanity. And we're going to get into one of those questions tonight. And the beating heart of this bookstore is the work and leadership of Bob Avakian, the architect of a whole new framework for human emancipation, as I said before, the new communism. Now, just to open us up in getting into this, and thinking about this one drop rule that Dr. Blay gets into in her book, I remember being a child and seeing a news story about a white woman who went to court to prove she was white. And I was like, why are you going to do that? Either you white or you ain't. And if you white, you know you white. What's the court got to do with it? But this woman was possessed by the feeling that she had to legally prove her whiteness, and she lost the court case. And I saw a little clip on TV where she came out of it and she said, "We're going to take this to the highest court of the land. I am white. I've lived white, and I'm not going to let them tell me that I'm not white." And I was like, why would you go through that? I was a child at the time, so I did not know. But now, as I've struggled against the savage oppression the system has brought down on Black people, learned the history of that, I realized the significance of this one drop rule and how it could fire people to do something like this woman did. I mean, now the problem is living in a world where you have to think that matters. You know, I also want to bring this up because when they talked about the one drop rule and in instituting it, they talked about maintaining the purity of the white race. Now, that meant something and didn't mean something, but I think it's significant that just this past weekend, they passed a voter suppression law in Texas, a law aimed at making it harder for Black and brown people to exercise their rights to vote. And in explaining it and justifying it, they said we have to ensure the purity of the vote. And they drew that phrase historically from 100 years ago, laws in Texas about the vote. But the purity of the vote actually came down to making sure Black people couldn't vote, because it was legislation introduced when women got the right to vote, making clear that the women who could vote were not Black. So that's what they meant with that purity. And when you go back to the one drop rule, they talked about the purity of the white race, but it did not mean that they were against race mixing, because white men mixed a lot with Black women. There was massive rape carried out. Any slave owner could carry that out with his female property. Any white man associated with the plantation could carry that out. The point to this, though, was to block it going the other way and to ensure that children who were born from these interracial liaisons of white men and enslaved women did not get freedom through having had a non-enslaved parent, but that they remained enslaved. This is the history of this country. This is what this country was built up on. So getting into this question, digging into it deeply, and understanding more about it is a very important thing that people have to do, because people have to know the history of this country. They have to know the real history of this country. They have to know where it came from, how it developed, in order to be in position to make some critical choices about what to do about it. That's about as far as I'm going to go right now. I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Yaba Blay. She's going to present on the book, and then later on, she's going to bring in Damon Young, and they're going to have a conversation. Then I'm going to come back in my moderator role. I might ask a couple questions pose a couple questions to the two of them. And I will be watching the chat, seeing what kind of questions and comments are coming up there from people watching this program. And I will be feeding those into the conversation here. So that's what we're going to do. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Blay, and she's going to take you on a journey around this book.
All right. Thank you, Carl. Good evening.
Good evening.
I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get us started. All right. So tonight we're going to have a conversation about Blackness, one that's very much connected to my book, One Drop Shifting the Lens on Race. So to start, we'll use the example of Robert Nesta, aka Bob Marley, a man who was born of a Black Jamaican woman and a white English father. In this moment, you might hear some people refer to him as quote unquote mixed, but you would have never heard him self identify as such. Although his skin color, hair texture, and general phenotype would make him the object of bullying as a youth, his genetic makeup had nothing to do with his racial or cultural identity. Bob Marley identified as a Black man. Bob Marley identified as an African, period. Although he was referring to a type of rhythm when he sang Feel It in the One Drop, there's an interesting parallel between the music and Bob's identity. Whereas the one drop rhythm has in many ways become the core of reggae music, the one drop rule has in many ways become the core of Black racial identity, particularly in the United States. It has created the Black race and the Black community as we know it today. And it has come to define not only the history of Blackness in the United States, but the racial history of the United States. The woman that Carl mentioned in his introduction is this woman, Susie Guillory Phipps. In 1977, she requested a copy of her birth certificate and discovered something about herself that she said would make her emotionally depressed and physically ill for the 3 days that followed. She discovered that she was colored. For 43 years, she had lived her life as a white woman because, in her mind and in the minds of at least two generations of her family, she was indeed white. However, according to her birth certificate, both of her parents were designated as colored. Therefore, so was she. What happened was she was getting ready to go on a trip. She needed a passport. For whatever reason, she hadn't seen her birth certificate before. I'm not sure. She had to get her birth certificate in order to get her passport. She gets her birth certificate. She sees that she is marked as colored. So, offended by what appeared to be a grave mistake by the state of the Louisiana, Susie Guillory Phipps sued the Bureau of Vital Records in 1982, demanding that they change her classification from colored to white. According to Phipps, she was white, plain and simple. She said, quote, I am white, I am all white. I was raised as a white child. I went to white schools. I married white twice, end quote. She argued that the 1970 Louisiana state law, which declared 1/32 of Negro blood as the mark of Blackness, illegal and unconstitutional, and she lost. A genealogist hired by the state informed Mrs. Phipps that she, in fact, had 3/32 of Negro blood. Her great, 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 great grandmother, Marguerite, was an enslaved African woman. Mrs. Guillory Phipps appealed her case and she lost again. According to the laws of the state of Louisiana, Susie Guillory Phipps was a Black woman. My question is, was she really Black? 25 years after the Phipps case, the United States elected its first quote unquote Black president in Barack Hussein Obama. Because he was born of a white American mother and a Black African father, even before he was elected into office, the nation was set afire in heated debate about his identity. Is he biracial? Is he African American? Is he even American? Where's his birth certificate? Despite the fact that the president himself self identified as a Black or quote unquote African American, to use his politically correct language of choice, there remained questions about who he was and exactly who he represented. The man said he was Black. Should that have been enough? More recently, most of you have either heard about or saw for yourself the interview that Oprah Winfrey had with Meghan Markle. And within this interview, some things were revealed that seemingly made some folks surprised. Meghan revealed in that interview that there was a concern within the royal family about how dark her son, Archie, would be, not how light, but how dark. And it's interesting because although we know that Meghan is of mixed background, we primarily know that because her mother has been so oop, at the forefront of the scene, right? And for many people, having a Black mother is enough to make one Black, no matter how light or how white presenting a person is. We know what your mother looks like, therefore, we know what you look like. My book, One Drop Shifting the Lens on Race, focuses on Black racial identity and skin color politics, and in many ways represents a conversation about Blackness and considers questions of who's Black, who's not, and who cares. Rather than to tell you the specifics of the book, because of course I want you to buy it yourself and read it for yourself, I just want to give you some context to understand how it is and why it is I chose to do this work. More generally speaking, my work focuses on the lived experiences of Black people, capital B, and people of African descent all over the world. For me, Blackness is a global identity, but it's also a political one that not only reflects race, but reflects culture. And within my work on Blackness, I focus much of my attention on skin color politics and colorism. Pretty straightforward. We'll flash back to 2010. I was on a panel with this woman, Rosa Clemente, hip hop activist, community organizer, 2008 Green Party vice presidential candidate. And we were on a panel together at the Caribbean Cultural Center in New York City discussing skin color politics across the diaspora. And for as learned and as well versed as I thought I was on skin color politics and colorism and global Blackness for that matter, I mean, I do have a PhD in Black studies. I found myself distracted each and every time she self identified as a Black Puerto Rican woman from the South Bronx. Yes, at the time, I knew several Puerto Ricans, but I had never met a Puerto Rican who self identified as Black, and certainly not Black Puerto Rican. Where I grew up, there wasn't a large Latinx community and certainly not a large Afro Latinx community because I grew up Black as I am in New Orleans, Louisiana. And there you're either Black, white, or Creole. And in my experience, folks who had the quote unquote privilege of identifying as Creole did. And as far as I was concerned, they were just saying that they were Creole, so they didn't have to say that they were Black. In my experience, many Creoles rejected Blackness. And in my experience, many Creoles rejected me. I remember not being invited to the birthday party of one of my very best friends in elementary school because she said her mama said I was too Black. Later, as an adult, I wasn't invited to an adult colleague's wedding for the very same reason. So, this is what I understood about Creoles, that what it meant to be Creole was very much predicated upon what you look like and where you lived and what your last name was. And so, as far as I was concerned, Creoles didn't want to be Black and didn't have to be. And they were given the option not to be, and they took it. And so, anytime I encountered one or anyone who even looked like one, I already knew what it was. I already knew who they were or who they weren't, or so I thought. But then in meeting Rosa, I started questioning a lot. I started rethinking what I thought I knew, not only about folks who looked a particular way, but about Blackness in general. And so I started this project and wanted to investigate what I was then calling the other side of Blackness. I interviewed over 70 people representing 25 different countries and countries of origin, ranging in age from 21 to 103 years old. 58 of them are included in the book. The book not only features short narratives, which I wrote based upon my interviews with them, but it also includes a portrait of each of the contributors. Um, and while the contributors use a variety of terms to self identify, they all see themselves as part of a larger racial and cultural group, generally referred to as Black folks. All of them have had the experience of having their identity called into question based upon their appearances. And most of them have been asked, "What are you?" Or the more politically correct, "Where are you from?" Time and time again. And so in our conversations, the very first question that I ask all of them is, how do you identify racially and culturally? Black Puerto Rican, Black from Louisiana, Black Latina, Black and or mixed race, mixed and or Black, Black of mixed heritage, Afro-Cuban or Black, African American, Black, African, mixed and or Jamaican, Black, Black American Muslim, Black. Part of the purpose of the book is to examine how it is that we, as Black people, come to identify and define ourselves. Historically, this is a graphic representation of what it has meant to be Black by law in the United States. In the history of the United States, a Black person has been defined as any person with any known Black African ancestry. Although this definition has been referred to as the one Black ancestor rule, the traceable amount rule, the rule of hypo descent, it is more popularly known as the one drop rule, meaning that one single solitary drop of African blood is enough to render a person Black. Said differently, the one drop rule holds that a person with any trace of Black African ancestry, however small or invisible, cannot be considered white. They must be considered Black. Now, you should know that no other ethnic group is defined or counted according to the one drop rule. You should also know that the one drop rule is characteristically American, meaning that in no other nation or society does this rule have applicability or even make any bit of sense for that matter. In fact, in many places for a person of African descent, any one drop of anything else is enough to render that person something else. In the introduction of the book, I map out a history of how it is the United States came to adopt such a specific and seemingly quantitative definition of Black identity. And it was important for me to provide that context first because I want us to think critically about how it is that we, as Black people, come to identify and define ourselves. Many of us have accepted the one drop rule as our own, but the truth is we didn't create it. And because of this, many others of us reject the one drop rule and resent definitions of Blackness that don't originate with Black people. So once we come to know and understand the history of race in this country, especially, my question is, does that necessarily mean that we should reject the one drop rule altogether? And if the answer is yes, my next question is, how then might we quantify Blackness as a group identity? How then might we qualify Blackness as a group identity? Who would be Black and why? Or better stated, who would be Black and how? A large part of what I'm attempting to do with this project is to get us to reimagine Blackness, if you will. It's definitely not my goal to tell people how to identify. It is, however, my goal to help us to think more critically and more globally about the politics behind our identities. Before I pull Damon in, I wanted to highlight this woman who's featured in the book. Her name is Joanne. And in speaking with Joanne, she was referred to me, of course. Someone said, you know, you should talk to Joanne for the project. And so in meeting Joanne, what I came to find out is that Joanne has vitiligo and lost all of her uh, skin color through this autoimmune disease. Now, when most of us hear vitiligo, we think of someone who looks like this. This woman is Sembany, who is also featured in the book. But Joanne also has vitiligo, but lost all of her complexion except for one small brown dot on her leg. And so, in speaking with her, it made me think and rethink about Michael Jackson. Not only because I grew up in the 80s, and so I'm a huge Michael Jackson fan, but because I remember when Michael's complexion started to change and so many people had so many things to say about, you know, how he wanted to be white and how he was bleaching his skin. And what's interesting, I did my dissertation research on skin bleaching, and I could tell you that no matter how much money you have, right? there's not enough money to get your skin this color. Most folks who bleach their skin usually have some sort, they damage the skin, right? And the sun fights against those products for the most part. And so they usually don't have an even complexion for the most part. And so looking at Joanne and then looking at Michael Jackson's complexion, I don't think Michael was lying to us, right? He had other issues, but I don't think he was lying to us about this. This is Joanne holding a picture of her former self prior to the vitiligo. So again, questions of, you know, what is blackness? Are we only thinking about blackness as what one looks like? Because Joanne lost all of her complexion, should her blackness be called into question? She talked a lot about being white presenting now, right? That many people don't recognize her as a Black woman anymore. So, yeah, I just thought that was something interesting to throw out there. So, we'll pull Damon into this conversation. I'm interested to know what you think about this, sir. Hope you're still muted.
Let me get on mute. Yeah, I got two very Black children. one, one is 2, one is 5. So you might hear them. You know, they're taking a bath right now. My wife is upstairs doing that, so I'm just giving everybody a heads about that. But yeah, this is. I mean, your book and your work is fascinating, and this is a thing that I think about very deeply, and it's very intimately also. Like what does and the whole concept of one drop, it's ridiculous, it's absurd, it's violent. But even as you're talking about your book and you're talking about some of the profiles and that comprise it, I was thinking like, you know what, I kind of dig it. I kind of dig the one drop thing because it just makes a bigger tent. So there's just more of us. So we could just claim a whole bunch of different types of people. Oh, yep, you Black, you my cousin, you a nigga. Like you could just keep going all the way down the line with that. And so I kind of, from that vantage point, I'm kind of feeling it, even as I recognize the historical, danger and violence and whatever that led to this rule.
Yeah, I mean, I had a similar experience primarily because so much of this work was like healing for me in a lot of ways, like trying to make sense of my own experiences growing up in New Orleans and feeling rejected. And so I think the thing that made me distracted by the conversation with Rosa is just like, you have the option not to be Black and you're choosing to be Black. You know, that fascinated me because, again, so much of what our lived experience says, so much of what projected images of Blackness says is like, why would somebody choose that? But the thing that came out for so many of the folks that I spoke to is for them, they don't feel like it's a choice.
Yeah, so a question for you. Like when did you first, I guess, develop like a cognizance of race? Like did you have an epiphany? Was it more of like a gradual thing? Can you pinpoint like a time where you're like, you know what, this is when it happened?
I've thought about, I can't say that I do. I mean, I grew up, my family is Ghanaian, I'm first generation. So I'm more cognizant of like having to grow up in two cultures, really, living in a very Ghanaian home and then growing up in a very Black community. I went to all Black schools growing up. I could probably count the white folks at my school. So I knew there was a difference, but it wasn't something like I hear a lot of folks who talk about being one of two in an all white environment. I didn't have that experience. So yeah, I can't say that can you pinpoint?
Yeah, you know what? I was talking to my wife about this the other day, about how my first and maybe I had a recognition before this, but the thing that is this core memory is watching the 1984 Olympics, right? And when you watch the Olympics, I mean, you have some sports that are dominated by Black people. You have your basketball, your track and field, things of that nature. But the majority of the sports that you're going to see that are televised, you see the people from all these different countries, and you don't see as many of us
Right.
in some of those competitions, the swimming, the gymnastics, the diving, just going down the line. And
Right.
so I remember thinking, like, in order to be an Olympic athlete, I probably should be white. In 1984, I was 5 years old. Okay. And again, just thinking about that, and recognizing how absurd it is for a person for anyone really to say, in order to be this great athlete, I need to be white. But again, that's my first memory
Right.
of having any sort of cognizance of race. And as I grew up, I grew out of that, and I began to see that actually, most of the dominant athletes, and it goes into the stereotype about this hyper, athletic, hyper human, blackness or whatever, but most of the dominant athletes were Black. But again, my first cognizance of race came 1984 Olympics, me watching it with my parents and just seeing what was in front of me, and thinking that I needed to be something different in order to get, to be an athlete on that level.
Right. I think I was more cognizant of colorism in my
Okay.
competition,
Mm-hmm.
because everyone made comments about it, So
Mm-hmm.
I knew that I was dark skinned very early on because much of, even what we look like and how we see ourselves is in comparison to other folks, right? So when other
Mm-hmm.
folks are constantly pointing out to you, oh, you're this, you're dark, you're Black, I'm like, okay,
Mm-hmm.
I guess I am. Because in my Ghanaian family, I'm not the darkest one. And it wasn't a point of conversation, you know? So yeah.
Well, that actually is a perfect segue to another thing I wanted to ask you about, because okay, you're from New Orleans, and you have this Ghanaian background, and this is obviously, I guess, help to inform how you see race,
Mhm.
right? And I guess I kind of asked that question in the question, but how has your place informed your thoughts on race? Like, do you feel like if you maybe grew up in Atlanta or DC or Sacramento, that your feelings about race would have, shifted a bit?
Maybe. I mean, I think New Orleans is absolutely part and parcel to this, but there's
Mm-hmm.
like, because for me, race is a scam, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that it just played out that way, particularly again, growing up in New Orleans, having folks who we would call passe blanc,
Mm-hmm.
folks like Susie Guillory Phipps, who I mentioned in the presentation, this idea that like, what is race? If I'm looking at you and you look like these people who y'all say is white, but y'all have all of these other reasons why you're not white, like what is this?
Mm-hmm.
And so I
Mm-hmm.
think I've always had critical questions about like, well, who gets to define these things? Who's empowered to say you're Black, you're not Black, you're white, you're not white? And even, that's why it was so important for me to even open up this conversation, because what I recognize, even in the context of us talking about race ad nauseum, most folks don't know the history of race. Most folks take race as a fact,
Mm-hmm.
right? When in reality, it is not. And so it takes us to think critically about how we even got here, to
Mm-hmm.
defining race. Because think about it historically. Jews haven't always been white, Italians haven't always been
Mm-hmm.
white, Irish haven't always been white. In this moment, folks from North Africa get to be white. Like who is having these meetings to determine, who gets to be white? Right? As if that's the prize, but it's also to get us to think critically about the politics of that, right? The negotiations of power at play with that, because you're not going to let somebody into the fold if you're
Mm-hmm.
not gaining something from that, you
Yeah,
know?
yeah, and even as the country, as the I guess the proportion of white people in America shrinks, and we think that, oh, okay, well, this is, Republicans ain't ever going to win another election, and all these certain things that, you know, I guess go with that changing demographic. And, you know, as you pointed out, who is defined as white can always change. Like that umbrella can just, that tent can reopen.
Right.
And it's like, you know what? Hey, you Mexicans, you're white now. All of you. All of you, all, you know, and again, that's a thing that could be, that is on the table because it has happened before. Again, it happened with Irish, it happened with Italians.
Right.
And you know, it's a thing that if people are seeing white people are seeing their political influence and power shrink, they just, you know, open up their ranks to
Right.
include more people.
Right. I want to encourage folks to, I did this last week. I've only watched 2 episodes, but I started watching Exterminate All the Bruce. Did you watch it?
You know what? I watched 2 episodes. I think there's 4, right?
Yeah, there are 4.
Yeah, and I watched 2, and it's a lot. It is.
I watched the first episode and I was pissed within the first 7 minutes, right? And by the time I finished watching the first episode, I was like angry and texting folks like, have you watched this? You got to watch this. But the reason why I bring that up is because I think Raul Peck does an amazing job, right? It's not stuff that I myself didn't know at all, but the way that he connects the dots and uses imagery. But I think the thing that jumps out that I keep saying and I want people to hold on to is the notion that there is no purpose for race aside for racism. Race is not real in terms of like a biological fact or reality, right? That yes, it's here, we live with it, it's part of our lived reality. But again, if you don't connect to that history, then you won't understand why race functions the way it, because at its foundation, at its core, it was only created to support racism. Whiteness was created to support white supremacy. That's it. It's not real. They define whiteness as pure. What's that?
Yeah, I mean, racism is the father of race, not the son. You know, and yeah, this is not new. And as you were saying, you know, these things that are used to control, to subjugate, to colonize, you know, it's this made up shit. It's
Yeah.
this made up shit to have some sort of justification.
Yeah.
Where, you know, and even as that documentary, you know, examine about just all of the, you know, all the shit about brain size and penis size and head size and all the things that are like, you know what, we want to treat these people this way, so we need to develop some sort of justification for it. We need to communicate to everyone else that they are subhuman, and that's the way we are going to justify this treatment and allow and I guess not just justify it, but give it like some sort of, I don't know, like some sort of validation.
Oh yeah.
Also, too. You know, so let's just give them all these stereotypes. Let's just give them all these, you know, all these deficits, and then, you know, whatever we do to them will be like, well, this is what we were supposed to do because we are the dominant ones, and this is
Right.
how it's supposed to work.
But that's the thing, right? Just in terms of even their research methods, it wasn't that let's go see if we're predominant. It's we're predominant. Now let's go compare everybody else to us. So it's a fallacy at its core. But in that same vein, what it makes me think of, right? So historically, white racists have created race. They've defined Blackness in a particular way, and they've given us these definitions, and we've met them, right? If we put that to the side, how are we to define Blackness? Because no one's ever looked at me with my Black self and said, what are you? Right? Or asked me to defend or define my Blackness, which is an experience that most folks in the book have had. So if you ask me what is Blackness, I'm like, what do you mean? You know, what do you mean it's Blackness? How do you think you would define Blackness if you had to?
I mean, that's a tough one because, you know, there's cultural Blackness, and then there's aesthetic, I guess, Blackness.
Okay.
And those two concepts have considerable overlap, but they don't always.
Mhm.
Now I believe that everyone who looks, I feel like the only people who are able to be culturally Black are people who also look Black too. But then even me saying that out loud, there are people who define themselves as Black, who have, maybe a Black grandparent, or, maybe a skin condition, or something of that nature, who don't necessarily immediately look Black. And, I've joked before about how we all have this superpower where we get to see Blackness in people. Like when there's like this conversation about Meghan Markle, it's like, man, of course she's fucking Black. There's no doubt. There ain't no doubt that Meghan, like when people are saying it, that they couldn't tell, like, who the fuck are you? Of course, no, yes, you can tell that she's Black, but she has some Black in her. Same conversation about like Mariah Carey and, Jason Kidd, basketball player. I mean, you could just go down the line of people who are very fair skinned, but you could tell.
That's our experience though, right? I feel like
Yeah.
culturally, historically, our eyes have been trained. I tell people all the time, like I'm from New Orleans, I can see Blackness a mile away. Like no matter how big, how small. I feel like we've been trained historically to be able to see it because it wasn't an option.
Mm-hmm.
You would have people in your family, you don't get to call them anything else because they're enslaved just like you are.
Yeah, I mean, for real, when it comes to that, we on some Indiana Jones type shit. Like we are the archaeologists, we're discoverers, we can see it.
So
It is even, Babe Ruth is another one. Like, he's, one of the greatest athletes of in American history. And you look at some of the pictures of him and like,
you see something there?
yeah, and then you listen or you read some of the things that people were saying about him back then, where they teased him about having nigger lips, and they talked about his nose, and he was always he was more comfortable than the typical white man at that time around Black people. So even then, there were rumors, and you look at him, it's like, yeah, I think so. I definitely think so. Yeah, someone, I forgot who it was. Someone had a whole Twitter thread about Babe Ruth last week. I'll send it to you, where they just went down a line, like look at some of these old articles where people had all of these questions about his race, and he got teased as a kid, and even as an adult for having certain features. So yeah, and he's from Baltimore. not that that means anything, but I'm just saying.
But it's like pushing us to think critically about Blackness, because even we've got a lot of folks who are clearly and unquestionably Black, but they don't have Black liberation in mind. They don't even like Black people, right? So we claim them and reject somebody else.
And again, that part is tricky because those are the people who maybe don't consider themselves to be culturally Black, right? And a part that has always fascinated me about, okay, the conversation that happens where some person, some kid, some adult who may have been teased for, who complains that they were teased for acting white or talking white, and they get on the internet and they have all these tweets, or they write a book, or they run for office or whatever, and there's always this pushback. It's like, no, Black kids don't, we're not anti-education. It's like, don't put this pathology on us. Kids tease because that's just what we do. And there's no, yeah, you might have spoke proper, but you weren't talking white. That's not a thing. But that is actually a thing. Like there is such a thing as talking white, because there are certain rhythms, like just as there's a cultural Blackness, there's a cultural whiteness too. And I think that if both of us just listen to 50 people with our eyes closed, repeat the exact same thing, we'd be able to tell with 85 to 90% certainty who was Black and who was white out of those people talking. And so again, even our conversations about the public conversations we have about race tend to be incomplete, because I feel like situations like that or details like that sometimes get flattened to make this larger point, or to, I don't know, because there maybe isn't as much space for the sort of nuance that is necessary for that larger point, because that point right there maybe isn't the thing that I would express on Twitter, because there might not be as much space to talk about, to really deconstruct that there is such a thing as sound white. There is. And so yeah, and just getting back to my point about, or the question about place and how place influences,
Yeah.
I guess, your understanding of race. Now, I'm from Pittsburgh, born and raised Pittsburgh, PA, and I've had to, I guess, just as your experience with Rosa kind of made you, I guess, this integrate or interrogate and kind of deconstruct your own thoughts and feelings about race and about racism, about blackness, about whatever. My growing up in Pittsburgh, my upbringing here, this is the largest, we are the whitest major metropolitan area in the country, the Pittsburgh metropolitan area. Okay. Like, even like you think of places, Minneapolis, Salt Lake, no, we are actually whiter. Pittsburgh is, yes. And the reason for that is demographically, we don't have like a large Latino community. We don't have a large Asian American community. We have a few, but in terms, like, compared to even a city like Buffalo or a city like Cleveland, or cities that are close to us and size or whatever, we don't have those sorts of populations. So in Pittsburgh, it's more of a black white binary.
Mm-hmm.
And I had to, once I left Pittsburgh and went to school and just, grew up and became an adult, I still have to remind myself sometimes when I'm thinking about race to not think of race in predominantly black and white terms, because that's how I just grew up thinking of race and thinking of racism, where I didn't even consider, that there are other people other than black and white people in America, because again, in Pittsburgh, it's just not a thing that you experienced or really saw as frequently as you might see in other, comparably sized cities.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting, because I do think many of us are centered in our own experiences, right? So for me, I think when it comes to race and identity, even when you were talking about sounding white and this black and white binary, I'm always questioning or drawn to the question of, like, well, what about people who are not American? You know what I mean? Like, there's an entire Black reality outside of America that may not look like or fit into the fold of what these kind of like stereotypical ideas of what Blackness is in the United States. And so I think in the United States, oftentimes it's like, if you don't come from the hood, if you don't speak with a particular cadence, if you don't listen to certain music and eat certain food, or even if, if your ancestors weren't enslaved, then you don't fit into this prototypical idea of Blackness. But there are so many more Black people in the world that do a variety of things. I mean, we're all interconnected, but like, even the language that we think about when you get a census or you get a job application, like, it grinds my gears when I see African American, because everybody ain't African American, you know? And then you have folks, because of the ways that African American or American Blackness is projected in the world, you have lots of folks in the world who resist and reject. They don't want to be called African American. And so internally, it becomes rat beef between us, without the context to understand where that's coming from, I think.
Yeah, that I have my own issues with that term. I think there are just inherent loopholes in it. What about like a white South African who's in America? They're also technically African American. Like, and again, that term just has so many holes you could punch in it. And I just felt like it's always been, it's been a term that was adopted and is used today for people, it feels like, who are uncomfortable with just saying Black. You know, uncomfortable with Blackness. And so, you know, you kind of add this, you know, euphemize it in a way. But yeah, I mean, the question of what Blackness means, you know, my whole fucking I don't know, my whole toolkit is American based.
Yes.
You know, all of my thoughts about it, all of my takeaways, all of my feelings, all of my, you know, even as far as like what I see when I see somebody, you know, and if it's American based, then that means it's white supremacy based. It's based on, you know, these rules that, you know, have been created for, you know, for our subjugation, for our oppression, and rules that we just, you know, kind of adopted. And it's like, well, this is how we see race too. And it's this is kind of, I guess, changing gears a little bit, but one thing that has always fascinated me, and this is getting back to your point about colorism, is how there is not really a consensus among us about what constitutes dark skin, light skin, brown skin. You could talk to 50 Black people and ask them you could talk to 50 Black people, give them a sheet of 100 Black people, and okay, point out which ones are light skinned, point out which ones are brown skinned, point out which ones are dark, and you would get 50 different answers. Or like, yeah, and it's one of those things that has always fascinated me. I have a homegirl who is from Florida, and we have, I'm not gonna say we have arguments, but we have had conversations multiple about just the definition of light and dark, and like she'll refer to someone as light skinned, and I'll say like, she's not light. No, she's not.
But it's also in comparison to who, and I say, because my scale is much different than a lot of folks in the Northeast, because I grew up in New Orleans. You know, and so I was having this conversation. I don't even remember who I was having this conversation the other day. But we were talking about some of the women MCs that are out now. A couple of them, one whose stage name is Mulatto, and then another one, I want to say she's from Atlanta, light skinned Keisha. But light skinned Keisha ain't like, where is
yeah. I don't know. She should have been. Yeah, she should be brown skinned. She should just be Black Keisha.
But you know, like, in comparison to who? But also, Keisha, what is it that you want me to know about you, right? As you step on stage and say that you're light-skinned Keisha, is there a particular value system that I'm supposed to assign to you because you're light-skinned Keisha as opposed to dark-skinned Keisha?
I'm still tripping over someone calling themselves mulatto. Like, I mean that is that'll never not be absurd to me. It's like, I mean, are we gonna have a rapper next who goes by Porch Monkey? Quadroon.
I wouldn't be surprised. It might be on the way.
On that light skin
Jungle Bunny.
I'm thinking of Eddie Harris and Les McCann, whose signature song is "Compared to What."
Compared to what?
and you got to do that because different people want to go at that differently. And on the one hand, go ahead if you really want to. But on the other hand, the world should not be one where people feel that invested in, well, I'm lighter skinned than that, hooray for me, or I'm darker skinned, and that's a real downer. It should be folks are different, and that diversity is part of what makes it real. You know, there were a lot of things that you all were going on that I wanted to come in on. That's why I cut in now.
Okay.
Before I get into that, I just want to remind people that the book, One Drop, Shifting the Lens on Race by Dr. Yaba Blay is available at Revolution Books. Come in and shop online at revolutionbooksnyc.org. You can get it there. You can also come into the physical store on Malcolm X Boulevard and 132nd Street in the village of Harlem. Check us out there. You can get Dr. Blay's book, and you can get books about the world and books for a new world. I wanted to bring that in and let folks know that the book is available, where they can get it, how they can get it through Revolution Books. I did want to step back a little bit because you talked about the international dimension of this, and I wanted to cut into that a bit because, look, America, and you bring this out in your book, was actually unique in this one drop rule. You go a lot of other places and it just don't exist, or even exists in the reverse.
Right.
As opposed to one drop makes you black, one drop of something else makes you something else.
Right.
And I think that's an important thing, and important in how you put the book together, because you didn't just look at, well, what does the one drop rule mean for Black people here, but took into account the fact that there is a global African diaspora, and there was a lot of back and forth between that diaspora. And I say that as somebody who came up in the 1960s, and look, it mattered to a lot of us that people like us, while we were fighting for freedom here, people like us were fighting for freedom in Africa, in England, and other places. And there was a certain commonality, but then there were also differences, because I remember, I think it was Linton Kwesi Johnson, the musician from England, comes from a Black background. And I remember him talking about the struggle to get people to recognize their Blackness, but it was a different kind of struggle, because there was a view that embraced people from India, people from Pakistan, the Caribbean, and we all Black, which then started a whole nother controversy,
Right.
because some of them didn't want to be Black.
Right.
Kind of like, thanks, but no thanks.
Right.
And then among people who did see themselves as Black, well, we don't want to open the doors to them. But there was a question of the basis to pull together solidarity. And it's actually important to see that, as you pointed out, the reality of race is that it was constructed. You know, because the guy who came up with the division into the three great races, Caucasian,
Right.
Negroid, and Mongoloid,
Right.
the dude was a charlatan scientifically. This whole thing about the purest whites come from the Caucasus area. Well, right now, people from the Caucasus who go to Moscow are called Black. But that's supposed to be where the purest whites came from. And then you look at how they put it together. Well, we're going to measure the size of the brain by looking at these skulls, but then they would throw out skulls which it didn't fit.
Right.
They had already come to the conclusion. Then they wanted to find some skulls that went with it. And if they found a Black person with a large cavity in his skull for a Black brain, they just threw that one out. That kind of stuff. And it was similar to how they did men and women, saying, well, men's heads are bigger, so they must have bigger brain. Well, men's bodies are bigger too, you know, so that ain't being real scientific. But I just thought that this point about going international with the book and drawing on that kind of experience and showing how it related to, how it differed from, but also how it overlapped with the experience here was something that at least struck me about the book. I don't know if there's more that you wanted to say about that, but I did want to bring that up.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think again, it's about challenging all of us because I think we are very American centered in how we look at the world, and that may or may not be a good thing. Um, Also, thinking of Blackness as an identity is so much more than, for me at least, how people look, and it's also about resisting these kinds of these notions of race that have been presented to us because I think so folks often say race is socially constructed, but it feels empty when I hear it because what they're not saying is that it was socially constructed for the purpose of oppression, right? You got to add that part to it. It's not just to say, oh, it's socially constructed, so it's not real. There are very real implications um, for it, but also for us to be thinking about Blackness bigger than race, but as a political identity, Because I think about the kind of tensions that happen with folks from throughout the diaspora. A lot of times, Black as a term is conflated with American. So there are a lot of folks from the Caribbean, a lot of folks from Africa who don't want to identify as Black because in their minds and in their experiences, Black means American. They want to hold on to their ethnic and their cultural identity. But for me, it's like getting us to recognize the political nature of a Black identity in the same way that there's a political nature of a white identity, right? They're not saying European American, they're saying white. And there are implications for that, right? So what does it mean to say Black? Like there's a time to be Black, there's a time for me to be Ghanaian. You know what I mean? And Blackness for me is a larger umbrella under which we all fit, but as a political tool, if you will, right? Blackness is the identity that becomes. So it's not just about Black and white in the American sense, it's also about how Blackness functions throughout the world.
Okay, if you want to come in on that, Damon, you can, or I can go.
We got questions?
We got questions. I got one more, and then we got some things coming
I
in.
muted myself. As I said earlier, I guess the international aspect of Blackness and understanding what Blackness means once you leave American soil is something that I'm not as well versed in. So I will lean on Dr. Blay, the school us, the school me, because again, I've traveled and I've witnessed. I guess I had an experience a couple years ago, like during my book tour or whatever. I was in England for a little bit, and I hung out in Brixton, and it felt like I was in DC. Like it felt like, holy shit, I'm thousands of miles away from home, but I feel like I'm home right now. I actually feel more home than I do in my literal home in Pittsburgh, right? And so I've had those experiences, but in terms of unpacking the political implications of how different people from different nations regard themselves in connection to Blackness, that yeah.
But for me, that's the experience right there. So like we get caught up in the definitions and what people say race is, but like that question of what is Blackness, it's that connectedness that you felt in Brixton, right? And it's bigger than like what we look like. How do we do? Right? We eating similar foods, we dancing to similar music, we dance in the same style. You know what I mean? Like I feel like there's a particular connection that we have all over the world that we may not be able to name, but we have to actually physically get out of the United States to actually go and experience and see what that feels like.
Yeah, and I agree with you. And one of the more fascinating things about it is how there's all these different types of Black people all across the world. But when you visit them, when you talk to them, when you eat their foods, you just see, holy shit, these commonalities exist. And these commonalities often exist without any sort of interactions. Like, okay, these Mississippi Blacks have never met these I don't know, Ghanaian blacks.
Right.
But, you know, when they meet each other and they talk to each other, it's like, holy shit, we're cousins.
We absolutely.
Our music sounds alike. Our
We
food tastes the same. You know, we have the same, we might even be speaking different languages, but we speak the languages we speak with the same rhythms
Right.
sometimes too, the same
Right.
intonations. And
Right.
so yeah, that connectivity that exists is one of the most fascinating things I think of just existing. You know, existing as a human being is just being able to see that and experience that.
For certain.
Okay, I've got a couple of comments that I'm going to run to you, and then I got a few questions that are coming in.
Okay.
The first comment is on One Drop. Person loved it and said it should be in school libraries everywhere.
Thank you.
And then somebody else brought in, or maybe it's the same person, I'm not sure. I can't tell who posed it. And Damon's book is good too. I have them both.
Thank you.
So I just want to hear that.
It is.
Another person said they were listening to a podcast where this question came up, and it was posed to the listeners of the podcast, and there were an infinite number of preferences. You know, people had all kinds of ways that they came at it in relation to that. Now, I want to get to a couple of questions that came up. The first is from someone who loved the book and currently has it on their nightstand. And they ask, is there any advice for helping children navigate how they choose to identify?
You know, this is a question that comes up a lot, and I always say that I chose to teach college because I get to cuss them out. Um, they're adults. I don't know if I know how to speak to children, but I do know that I don't think we give children enough credit for how much they can process, right? I remember seeing a tweet during the Derek Chauvin trial that said something about like, I don't want to hear white parents talk about their kids not being ready to talk about race when we have a 9-year-old girl on the stand testifying in this case, right? This idea that whether we give them credit for it or not, whether we talk to them directly about it or not, children are attuned to what is happening in the world around them, and they're already having their own experiences. And so, again, what's interesting in terms of vantage point is that I remember my father having conversations with me about my identity, but it wasn't about you're Black. It was like you're Ghanaian, right? Like we're in this country, you're being raised in this environment. Don't ever forget where you come from. So I remember it was like, you know, drill sergeant sitting me down, reminding me constantly of who I was. I think, and I'm not sure, and Damon, you're a parent, so you can chime in. What's interesting is like, I feel like when our children come out unquestionably Black, I'm not sure that many of us have that conversation with them, right? About what their identity is, because there is no choice and there is no conversation. I do hear from a lot of parents of mixed race children, however, this question of like, how do I help them navigate this space? You know, is it better for me as a parent to give them their identity and say, this is who you are, or give them the space to figure it out for themselves? And so I'm not sure, but I do know that I've heard from a lot of parents that the book has been helpful for their children to at least see and to read and to see how many folks have come into their identity in their lifetime and begin to ask their own questions. So I have no idea if I answered that question, but I do think it's tricky. What do you think, Damon?
I think that was a perfect answer. Only thing that I would add is that I think that, you know, so I have two Black children, a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old, 5-year-old daughter, 2-year-old son. And, you know, so there's this infamous talk, right, that Black parents are supposed to have with their children. There have been books about the talk, TV shows about the talk, talks about the talk, right? And I recognize the need for shit like that to guard your children and to give them a context for the world that they live in, for the country they live in. But I think that for any, or at least as a parent, I don't want them to be thinking of their blackness as like a burden
Mm.
or like some pathological thing or some sort of target or whatever. Like, obviously, yes, you're going to know about America. You're going to know about what America does, who America is, and all that. But that I feel like that education comes when you leave the house.
Mm.
You know what I mean? When they're in the house, though, they're going to know all the great shit about it. That connectivity that we were just talking about. The fact that there's a broom on a wall, and that's the broom that my wife and I jumped when we got married. Like, just all these like little, just minute details and idiosyncrasies and all the stuff makes that defines blackness, or at least Black Americanness.
Yeah.
I want I think that Black parents have an obligation to introduce their children to like all the fun shit, right? And then all the all of that shit first before you start on the, well, if you get stopped by a cop, like, okay, like, whatever. I don't want to be flippant, because that part is important too, right? I don't want to minimize the importance of that, but again, I just think that so many conversations about what it means to be Black, deal with it in a negative aspect, and I just don't want my kids to think about that and have to get to a certain age and have to kind of relearn,
Right.
how to think of themselves and how to think of their Blackness as a great thing.
No, I think that's an excellent point, though, because I think many of us take our Blackness for granted, and
Hmm.
so that might be part of the responsibility of a Black parent, is to like make sure your children understand the joy and the dopeness of Blackness, as you say, before they have to deal with the other stuff. I was having a conversation with one of the women in the book, Danny, who is mixed race, white Mennonite father, mother, Black father, and she feels very passionately like that parents of mixed race children should have to take a course. Like, you should have to learn or be trained on how to raise mixed race children, because unfortunately, I think we're in a space now where folks have bought into this notion of the browning of America, and that somehow mixing is going to make us better. And so, if I have a mixed race child, there's nothing that they have to deal with because they're somehow different. And here we see the murder of Dante Wright, and those cops don't care where your white mama is in that moment. You present as Black. So there's a huge responsibility, I think, in raising Black children in general, but particularly raising children who, may have an option to identify as a variety of things. I think the question is, it comes back to the question of how to help them navigate that space. And it's a question I have. I don't know if it's better to say, okay, you have a white mother, you have a Black father, you're Black, move on. Or you have a white mother, you have a Black father, here are all the variety of ways that people might see you, you decide. I'm not sure.
Okay, I mean, just myself personally on that, I think we have to get into this with our children in the context of the reality that they face. They will decide, they will make determinations. And I'm not going to lay out to them, you got to choose this, you got to choose that, or your mother and I chose this, so you got to go with us. But they should not be led to make that choice outside of the reality, because your point about Dante Wright was actually something that I thought about. Uh, I remember I went into the office of the Daily Challenge. It was a Black daily newspaper in New York. And the woman sitting behind the editor's desk looked like a white woman. But once I started talking to her, I realized, well, she was just a light skinned Black woman. And at the time, I was working on building resistance to the epidemic of police murder.
Mm.
And it turned out her son had been murdered by police in Oklahoma. And I got to know her family, and her family was like her, very light skinned, but you could kind of tell they were black. And at that night in Oklahoma, the police could tell that this very light skinned young brother was somebody they would consider black and treated him thusly when they beat him to death,
Mhm.
for trying to run from him, which was actually, it was a smart move, especially if he could have pulled it off, because look at what they did to him when they got him. It would have been much better if he could have gotten away. But and this takes me into the next question that I wanted to pose. I got two more questions coming from the chat. You made a point in your intro to the book talking about how historical definitions shape current racial identities and lived experience.
Mhm.
And what hit me in relation to that is that your lived experience is happening in the context of things that have been set down in the past and gone forward. But at the same time, that experience can react back on racial identity. And your point about the police did not care if Dante Wright had a white mother. That was not something they did not question him on that before they moved on him.
Mhm.
The woman pulled out the gun and said, "I'm going to tase him." The training cop pulled out a gun and said, "I'm going to tase him." The one who was training the other cops. So, okay, maybe she was that out of it that she couldn't tell the difference between a black gun and a yellow taser. I ain't gonna give it a benefit of the doubt though. But that was not something that they cared about.
Mhm.
And that experience can react back on this question of racial identity and where people stand. Because on one level, everybody with a heart and humanity should stand against the savage oppression that's brought down on Black people in this society historically and frankly around the world. And at the same time, on this question of where you fit in and if you could not identify as Black, should you take that stance? I remember running into someone who I thought was a white woman at a meeting back in the early 1970s at Howard University. And then she stood up and declared she was a Black revolutionary. And it turned out that in the context of America, she was a Black revolutionary. She had more than one drop,
Mhm.
you know, and it was like, and she knew she could have gone another route. I mean, really, she could have, because I was sure this was a white woman talking until she declared herself a Black revolutionary. And then even then, I had a couple questions for her.
Mhm.
But her feeling was that this is a part of me that's being dealt with. And even if I have a chance to try to avoid it, that is not an option I can take. She told me she couldn't live with herself if she tried to avoid this struggle
Mhm.
because of the opportunity that she had because of her light skin. So I guess I thought that historical definitions
It's,
shaping
so- it-
current identity.
it's interesting though too, because even as I think of all those stories that we hear about, it also makes me think about all the people who then, according to those laws and rules, are actually quote unquote passing. I keep hearing stories of folks, who are doing their AfricanAncestry.com or doing their AfricanAncestry.com DNA test and finding family members who living far off from the rest of the family, but living as white. And so it just makes me think of the case of Susie Guillory Phipps, that there are probably a lot of people in this world who believe they are white, but according to US historical law, probably aren't.
Yeah, if we do those ancestry digs on, let's just say there are people with tremendous incentive to not do that, to
Yeah,
not do that sort of digging, because again, if you've been on the soil, if your family's been on the soil for 200, 300, 400 years, I mean,
somebody.
chances are you got some drops in you.
Yeah, somebody.
Chances are somebody, a great 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 aunt, like somebody in your family tree, is a nigga. Like that's just the reality in America, right? And well, one thing I wanted to also add too, and this is I guess goes back to the point of the talk, right? And telling Black kids about, hey, you're Black in America and this is going to happen. Like, I also wonder how effective that talk truly is,
Hmm.
because you think of some of the young Black men and women who have been victims of police violence, and you think like, okay, would the talk have saved Sandra Bland?
Hmm.
Would the talk you know Ahmaud Arbery. I mean, you could just go down the list, go down the line. Like if they had acted a different way, would their circumstance would they still be alive today?
Right.
And and I feel like I don't know, and I'm still unpacking this. I'm
Oh,
new to this parenting thing, and I'm trying to figure this out for myself. It's almost like I'm at a buffet and I'm just all these different things that I could just put on my plate and decide to take back to my table. And I'm, that sushi. I don't know if it looks good
try your best.
right now.
I don't
Um,
I don't know if it's I don't know if it's as simple as I think we shouldn't put too much weight on the talk, right?
mhm,
Like I
mhm.
think the talk is necessary, but I don't know that the talk in and of itself would change the trajectory of somebody's life. But I do feel like not having the talk, there could be some implications, right? Like I just, and that's just the type of parent I am. I don't think it's right, or maybe right's not the word. I feel like it's a setup to try and create these like fantastical utopian everything is all good worlds for our children, and then they get devastated when they have to meet the reality of it, you know what I mean? So it's like, again, I don't know that we give children enough credit for what they can manage and what they can handle, and I think all of us deserve some level of truth, but especially children.
Yes,
Well,
I
it's to
think
that point. Well, I just want to say really quickly, and it's actually to that point that I've had some ambivalence about this talk thing. And again, as you were saying, it's not just a talk, it's a whole curriculum of conversations, of experiences that you communicate to your children about being Black in America, and what that means, whatever. But I know that children are extremely observant, extremely perceptive, and probably even more observant and perceptive than we are, because they don't have they're not dealing with all the other context. They're just seeing and feeling and like, what, this doesn't feel right. Or I understand this thing. I
Right.
understand this thing in a deep, visceral way that having an education about the thing maybe doesn't even really add to. Or it can add to. But my whole point is that I am still figuring this out. Right. And I think that, particularly, people, parents who have mixed race children, um, I think should also allow themselves some uh, grace, might not be the right word, but just understanding that we are still figuring this shit out too. That people who have been Black from day one
No
are
doubt.
still learning, are still figuring out, okay, this is how to navigate this, because America is switching shit up,
No
you
doubt. I
know.
think the thing that I heard more clearly and pronounced from mixed race children, folks who are in the book, is they just felt like they actually didn't have that level of grace. They're like, figure this shit out
Mm-hmm.
before you have children.
Mm-hmm.
Don't experiment on me when I'm already here. Like, have some grounding, have a stance on something, have some direction before you bring children into the world, because your love is not enough.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that it's incredible responsibility to bring mixed race children into this particular world, you know? So I thought that was interesting.
Okay, while you all were exchanging about 7 minutes ago, someone wrote in a response that they were a white parent of a black daughter who is adult, and they thought your response was perfect.
Thank you.
Okay, so I wanted to bring that in. And again, I want to remind people, One Drop, Shifting the Lens of Race. It's a book you should get, a book you should read, and you could get it at Revolution Books. Shop online at revolutionbooksnyc.org, or come into the physical store at 132nd Street and Malcolm X Boulevard. Check this book out. Okay, we got another question. Let's see. Somebody watching it raised the question, how to look at critical race theory, at times being ahead of political line and at other times being behind political line.
Is that a question?
They posed that as a question.
I'm not sure I understand. Help me. What about it? Looking at critical race theory.
I think they're posing that there are times when critical race theory seems to be in advance of things and helping to point the way, and then at other times it seems to be behind. That's how they're posing it.
Okay. I'm not sure how much I can add to that or respond. I mean, yes. I mean, I'm just in terms of the way that I approach my work, I lean a lot on history. I lean a lot on lived experience. I myself, Yaba Blay, I haven't found critical race theory as helpful in trying to understand the lived experiences of Black people, particularly in this country, right? And I think for a lot of folks, a lot of scholars, a lot of academics, we get caught up in the theory and it doesn't really land well with the experience. So I tend to let the experience lead me. And again, I don't know if that answers the question or even approaches the comment, but that's what I got.
I just want to add that I am fascinated by how much we talk about how critical race theory has become like
Thing.
this thing that is a nationally relevant conversation that is getting their school board meetings and like people fighting over this what was at one point there's a very obscure legal language to understand I guess the history of racism and race, and now it's become this boogeyman.
Yeah.
Like critical don't you gotta look both ways before you cross the street because critical race theory might be out there.
I,
Take some mace if you're gonna go to the ATM at night because critical race theory
agree.
might be behind you trying to mug you.
Agreed.
No,
Agreed.
it's absurd.
I tend to be the anti-academic in that regard because
Mm,
it's just been my experience in academia is that I wonder how much we talk about within our walls actually applies and lands to people's lived experiences. And it
mhm,
feels like there's a disconnect, much of it based upon the elitism of the space, you know? So
mhm,
I don't know.
Okay, I mean, here's one thing I will say. One of the reasons critical race theory is such a big thing and seen by so many people as a boogeyman is that there are some people who are trying to erase the history of this country.
Oh, yeah.
And they don't want to see anybody talking anything
Mhm.
about the history of race in this country because it's an ugly history. I mean, that's just real. If you actually look at it and look at the horrors that have been perpetrated, and they don't want that to be a topic of discussion. And
Right.
critical race theory has become the punching bag that they have used in relation to that.
Yeah, it's been like it's become this catch-all for any conversation about race.
Right.
And this is what they do, where there's this coded language that isn't coded at all. I mean, any reference to Chicago, for instance, is always, meant to evoke a certain pathological blackness. Critical race theory just falls in that same pattern of, finding something, latching onto it, and using it to kind of galvanize white people to weaponize their fears, and justify them.
Right.
Okay, and I thought I had one other question, but I can't find it now in the chat. Or one new message. Wait a minute. Okay. Before I get to this last question, I just want to briefly say Revolution Books needs support. So those of you who are participating in this program, listening to the back and forth, the information, the analysis coming from these two authors, people who have been at previous events, people who are looking forward to coming to our program on the 100 years since the Tulsa Massacre on June 1st, or checking out the used book sale that we're going to be doing um, this coming weekend to support the National Revolution Tour, or the film showing of the talk by Bob Avakian, why we need an actual revolution, how we can really make revolution. Revolution Books is a place where all of this happens. And to keep it as a place where all of this can happen, we need your financial support. We need you to contribute to Revolution Books. The pandemic was a very difficult thing for us to deal with. It cut off all foot traffic for a while. We've got back rent that we have to deal with. We also have to restock the shelves, hold more author events, serve as a center for a movement for an actual revolution. We got to be able to pay the rent to keep the doors open to do all of that. So we need you to contribute. You can contribute to Revolution Books based on the information that's on the screen now. So play that role, be a part of supporting this bookstore, because it is something that humanity really needs right now. Okay, now how do I get back to my screen so I could find that question? It's a question, and I got to get this thing to go back up to find it. All right, it is a question tying into the Middle East, and I can only see part of the question in the chat, and I don't know how to move it up. But the woman says that she is from the Middle East, a place that had been colonized. I can't see this full thing. Can you? A place that's been colonized for so many years. And her question had to do with the way a one drop rule manifested itself there. I'm trying to get one of my tech people to help bring up the question. Is there a way that you can bring it up? Yeah, and I don't know where it is. Okay, here, I got it up. One drop of white blood makes you Western, foreign, but not white. Middle Easterners think they are white. It's more of a comment than a question.
Okay. I can see that. Because again, in a lot of other spaces, if you have the opportunity, the option to create something other than the group that's being, oppressed, then people take that option. But again, I think around the world, given the ways that white supremacy is constructed, folks are very clear, or so they think, about what whiteness is until they give you access to it. So you can do all of those things and still not be considered white, right? But we see folks all over the world doing what they can to at least gain some incremental access, to change and or power as they see it.
Okay, I have one more comment I'm going to run to you. And if you want to comment on it, you can. This is somebody who's coming off of some of what you both said about how people who are now white didn't used to be white, the Irish, the Italians. And one of the listener or somebody watching the program said that Ben Franklin once wrote that Germans should be prevented from immigrating to America because they were not white enough. And that takes you back 200 plus years.
Mhm.
They were talking about this.
That's why I say it's all a scam. Like everything that you think you understand about race in this moment, right? You have to reverse. You have to look at history to come to see how all of it is just based upon people's whims, seemingly at certain times. That's why I keep recommending this documentary, Exterminate All the Brutes, because he maps so much of this out, right? Particularly in regards to the ways that it is situated and connected to political ramifications. This isn't just about, oh, today we like Germans. And another thing that he brought up was how Nazi Germany tends to take all of the flack for white supremacy in that region at that time, and they were but one nation, right? One group of people who felt that way, that these are widespread thoughts across Europe, right? But we give it all to Nazi Germany. But yeah, I can't recommend that documentary enough.
Yeah, the Nazis had allies.
They
They
absolutely
did. They did. They didn't work by themselves.
no, and I'm watching the documentary and they're talking about Henry Ford
Mm-hmm.
giving money, supporting the Nazi regime. They're talking about the dude who owner of Volkswagen, like all of these people. And I'm like, I can't even drive nice cars. Yeah, I'll support all of it. But yeah, it's again, when we think about history, at least for myself, as someone who has a deep respect for history, we also have to think critically about history, right? Because the histories that we are given, there's a political nature to that, meaning that the history that we are given K through 12 in the United States is not going to be the same history given to K through 12 students in other countries. Like the purpose of teaching us particular histories in this country is to make us so-called good citizens, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they're only going to give us the histories that make America look a particular way. Doesn't make it the truth.
Yeah,
And we certainly don't learn about race.
and just back on that Nazi point, not only did the Nazis have allies, some of the folks who fought the Nazis were carrying out horrific stuff in Africa,
Mm-hmm.
Belgium, in the Congo, like the British after World War II in Kenya, putting folks in concentration camps for demanding freedom and saying, if you ain't gonna get it, you're gonna take it. France as well in Algeria. So that was something that the imperialist countries shared, and it was just who was going to get to do it was more the question than whether it was going to be done, who was going to be the one in position to do it.
And also too, there's even like a present day, when we talk about how the Nazis were the only ones, where there's an incentive for us, for Americans, to teach our children that, because it allows us to kind of silo off like the racism. It's like, you know what, these people were uniquely evil, uniquely bad. So we're
Right.
just going to put them in this category and everyone else over here. And the same thing has happened today. Where even, I've read theories or whatever that, Derek Chauvin was basically like, scapegoated. Obviously he did a thing that he's a murderer and he's going to be in prison for a very long time. But it was also an opportunity for white supremacists, for racists, for police to be like, you know what, this is the bad this guy is the bad apple.
Right.
We are not like him. This person is distinct. He is different. He is abhorrent, and we have nothing to do with him. Throw him under the bus.
Yeah.
And again, that thing just continues to happen where racism becomes this very, like, I don't know, very singular and very specific,
Right.
sort of action and sort of violence and sort of behavior, when we know that it is, it's atmospheric.
Right. I mean, that's part of the reason why I try deliberately not to use the language of racism as much as I use the language of white supremacy,
Mhm.
because I make racism the problem of select individuals and not the foundation upon which this entire society has been built. And a
Mhm.
lot of people, they conflate white supremacy with supremacists, or they conflate white supremacy with, Klan or extremists, but it's like white supremacy is the ideology, it's the why.
Mhm.
It's the reasoning for all of these actions and behaviors. And so it makes people uncomfortable, but that's my goal.
Okay. And hopefully we've made some people uncomfortable tonight, but also some people comfortable, because some people really like what you're putting out. Uh,
I
I
appreciate
think we're at a point where we can wind up our discussion. Remember, you can get the book. It's one drop, Shifting the Lens on Race. It's available at Revolution Books. You can order from our online books shop, revolutionbooksnyc.org. It's up on the screen. Or you can come into the store physically on Malcolm X Boulevard at 132nd Street in the village of Harlem. Come by, check us out, get that book. And this is a place that you got to check out regularly, because we got a lot of events. A used book sale coming up 15th and 16th from noon to 7. Come by. It's an event to support the National Get Organized for an Actual Revolution tour. May 23rd, I believe it is. We're going to show a film of a talk by Bob Avakian, why we need an actual revolution and how we could really make revolution. June 1st, a program marking 100 years since the Tulsa Massacre. Come by, check this store out, and support the store through your purchases and donating to it. So that's it. I want to thank our authors,
Thank
Dr.
you.
Yaba Blay, Brother Damian Young, a very smart brother. That's the name of his is that a podcast? Remind me what.
It's a blog. It's a blog that I founded. I no longer actually. I kind of retired from it about a week and a half ago. So it's, if you're familiar with the Root, also it's a part of the Root. But yeah.
Okay, so I want to thank both of you for showing up and taking us through this conversation. And I want to thank the audience for participating in it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
So that's it. And since we're on Zoom, because sometimes I say at the end of these, you ain't got to go home, but you got to get up out of here. But since we're on Zoom, you might already be home. So ain't no sense in saying that, but I said it anyway.
All right.
Bye.
Good night, everyone.